So I've been photographing this storm as it's rolled in for the last like hour and a half or so, and it's finally getting fairly close. Getting close enough, it's starting to get a little intimidating. It seems to be picking up a little bit of steam as it gets closer, and I wanted to share with you guys how I approach photographing lightning at night. So when I shoot lightning, I prefer to just set up a time lapse and just try to keep that interval between each frame as short as I can. That way it increases my likelihood of catching a lightning bolt. Generally speaking, daytime lightning is one of the most difficult types of lightning to shoot, just because you're always struggling with getting your shutter speed long enough. Nighttime lightning is much easier to catch the bolts. Oftentimes the struggle is both composition, because you're shooting in the dark and you can't see what you're doing, depth of field, because you need to have a fairly wide open aperture to let in enough light, and it's a really high dynamic range scene because those bolts are very, very bright and the shadows are very, very dark. So what I often try to do is find something to silhouette against that sky. If you can find something really cool to silhouette against the sky, like a tree, I've even used my pickup for a shot. It helps because you don't have to have tons of shadow information if you're just creating a silhouette. So that's one of the things I'm looking for when I'm trying to find a composition for lightning photography. So settings for night lightning photography can kind of be all over the board. It really is determined by how bright your lightning strikes are. In this case, as the storm got closer to me, it was allowing me to stop down my aperture to f8, which would ensure not only a nice crisp lightning bolt, but it would also allow me to have enough depth of field so I had some sharpness in my foreground as well. I was using a shutter speed of 30 seconds, which would allow the ambient light to kind of build up throughout that exposure. So ideally I have some shadow information, and then ISO becomes the determining setting that dictates how bright that lightning strike is. In this particular case, I found ISO 400 to be a nice balance between letting in enough ambient light, but not blowing out the highlights around that lightning strike. And I'm just going to get a time lapse started. We're going to turn on intervalometer shoot mode. Turn that on. And then I've got my interval set for 31 seconds. That way, ideally, there's only 1 second in between each of these exposures. And if there is a lightning bolt in this direction, we'll get it. There's a couple other techniques that also work as well, one of which that I use fairly often is to actually shoot in bulb mode. So when you're photographing in bulb mode, it's going to take an exposure until you stop it. What I will do is I will get an exposure started. I will often let that run until I get a lightning strike or until my exposure starts getting too long. Typically anything longer than 2.5 minutes, you're going to start getting what's called hot pixels, where the sensor is heating up and you're actually increasing the amount of noise. But the benefit to this technique is that you're taking fewer photos and you're pretty much getting a lightning strike in every single photo. Also, by allowing that exposure to run longer, you're increasing the amount of ambient light and thus decreasing the dynamic range of the shot. So a lot of times if you're dealing with really bright strikes, really dark foregrounds, this is a nice way to increase the amount of ambient light. The third method is to use a lightning trigger of some kind. I've had very limited success with lightning triggers. I always tend to get kind of frustrated with them. They're expensive oftentimes, and the success rate is not 100%. In my opinion, you're better off just to use long exposures. So another really important thing that I haven't mentioned yet is focus. It's pretty challenging anytime you're doing any kind of night photography to get focused. And typically for photographing lightning, you want to be focused to infinity. So if you're on a DSLR, it's a lot easier. You can just turn your focusing ring to infinity. That's usually pretty accurate. Not quite so easy on mirrorless because the infinity mark isn't to be trusted. So if you look back behind me, we've actually got the moon that's poked out, which is kind of nice. And we have lights down on the horizon. So I'll get focused manually on one of those lights. Because it's so far away, that's going to be the same as infinity. And then I'll set up my composition and just go with that focus. So typically you always want to be focused to infinity unless something else is your main subject and the lightning is just a little bit of eye candy, I guess. So focus to infinity. Also, another really important thing to talk about when talking about lightning and storm photography in general is safety. So one of the things that I always try to do is I try to shoot these storms from the edges. It's a really bad thing if a storm goes right over the top of you. So this particular storm is kind of heading right for me, which means that there's going to come a point where I have to call it quits. You don't want a storm to go right over the top of you. For one, it's not photogenic anymore because you're just going to be shooting in the rain. But if you shoot from the edges, you often get better photos because you're looking at the side of the clouds. You're not shooting in a rain cloud, and you're able to just get better shots.